Hi, this is Senator Ed Markey, and I'm joined today by the Reverend Lennox Yearwood, who is the founder and president of the Hip Hop Caucus. And today we're going to have a conversation about climate change, about the Green New Deal, about the urgency that surrounds our need to act and act quickly. So great to be with you again. Reverend Yearwood.
Senator Markey, it is always a pleasure to be with you. And actually, it's an honor always to be with you because of what you have done as being a champion on climate legislation. And so I want to thank you. What you have done for decades now has been understanding how important policy is, particularly policy in regards to climate policy. We understand that either you shape policy or policy shapes you. So I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank you for understanding this moment and how critical this moment is. Nobody, I just want to tell you, as somebody who's been a climate activist for the many years that I've been a climate activist, I will tell you that nobody has been trying to shape climate policy like you have. And I think that, it's very interesting because of what you have, what you have learned, obviously, from almost 12 years ago, back when we had the Waxman Markey and the ACES process, to where we are now with the Green New Deal. And I think that process of learning and shaping and understanding where we as a country, where we as a movement is very important. And so I'm excited because I, as you know, believe that the Build Back Better Act is critical. And I believe that the kind of provisions in that is so important that we need to make sure that moves forward, that we've stood together, knowing that we have pledged, and hopefully no climate, no deal, understanding how important climate is. But I also understand that as a movement, and obviously this is an inside-outside strategy, it's important for us who are climate justice, environmental justice advocates to understand that where we stand, both with the policy, but what needs to be done in regards to environmental justice. The reality is that in our communities, in our beautiful country here in America, we have people, Republicans and Democrats, independents, who are literally breathing in dirty air and dirty water. They have lead in their pipes. They are suffering because particularly Black people and brown people and indigenous communities, are living too close to coal-fired power plants. And so they are suffering from asthma and cancer and emphysema. And so that doesn't need to be the case because we need to transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. And so this is why, obviously, putting forth the policy that we have, we should get into that conversation, but also what we can do outside and what we need to do from everything from fighting the pipelines across our country to stopping petrochemicals that are rising up from Cancer Alley to outside in West Virginia. So, Senator Markey, as you can tell, I'm honored. I'm excited. Hip Hop Caucus has been a stalwart of doing this work. I'm just happy to have this conversation.
Well, it's my honor because you are not only an expert on climate, but you take it to where the discussion has to go. That it is the national security, healthcare, environmental, and national security and moral issue of our time. And what you, Reverend Yearwood, absolutely provide as an essential in this debate is that moral dynamic, because we know that those who are most vulnerable are those who suffer from the environmental justice legacy of our country. Even back after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, you set up the Gulf Coast Renewable Campaign to just deal with the Katrina survivors. So you and I, we were together last fall, and we had just a great event around no climate, no deal for the Build Back Better bill. And I'll be honest with you, your remarks that day, they really moved me. And not only is it an honor for me to be with you today, but exactly 3 years ago today, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and I introduced the Green New Deal. So it's 3 years old today. And that helped to create a movement around these issues. Could you just talk about the moral obligation to combat the climate crisis and what the listeners should feel, today and act upon as we reflect upon where we sit today in our country and on the planet?
I can. And again, I'm excited that, hopefully that 3 years we can bring that climate policy right up to the forefront and to passing. But, for me, you mentioned Hurricane Katrina. And, I was actually in Washington, D.C. when Hurricane Katrina hit. But that is my home state. That is where family and friends. And so I sat there in my house, literally watching my family and friends drown in the richest country in the world. I literally watched them as they were on top of rooftops. And we, as you mentioned, as a hip hop caucus, and I want to be very, very clear that I am a very proud president and CEO of this organization. That this organization is just an amazing organization, and that I could not have done any of the work that I've done without the Hip Hop Caucus. But within that to me, as someone who also served in the Air Force, I watched and particularly watched poor people and Black people left behind in the richest country in the world, and that to me is wrong. And I think that anybody who allows for that, who thinks that's okay, that we are creating a world where we are having hurricanes and wildfires and droughts, and we're having floods, and that we're creating conditions that allows for the most vulnerable, particularly people of color, to be not only left behind, but to drown, literally drown while they're holding their children's hand, kind of put their children, literally drown. People like Mama D, Diane French Crow, who was the first Black woman to lead up the NAACP in New Orleans, literally in her community in the 7th Ward on Derjewan Street, where she there would see her neighbors floating down the street during Hurricane Katrina. And her and her son would come out there and tie them to the tree so they wouldn't float away. Grandmothers floating down the street, and she would tie them to the tree because she said, "Those are my neighbors." That has to be our moral obligation because we have to look at everyone as our neighbors. We can't allow, because we are creating a world where people will be floating down the streets, not only in New Orleans, but in Boston, in Detroit, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, all over this country. We'll be having situations where we'll be looking out there and be like, that's our neighbors who are floating on the street. So this is why this moment is so critical. This is the beginning of Black History Month, and so this is a moment here, if you look back, and I always reference this to the Norcon A&T, an amazing HBCU, and the history of that when those 4 students went to the Woolworth's counter and they sat there because they realized in the 20th century that the issue of equality was their moment, where we are now fast forwarding that 62 years later, where the climate crisis is our lunch counter moment for the 21st century. And we're dealing not only with that crisis, but we're dealing with equality. So this is our moral moment. This is where we are, Senator, and this is the reality. And so hopefully people who are listening understand this is not about Republican or Democrat. And this is about humanity. And what's needed here more than anything is that we need to have a movement that is a broad-based, multiracial, multicultural, multi-issue, multi-gender, popular, uniting people of color, women, youth, LGBTQIA people, trade unionists, farmers, small business people, people with disabilities, professionals, and others type of movement right now to solve the climate crisis.
Well, Reverend, some people just think this is a game, it's just politics, and it's just Democrats versus Republicans, and it's really not that important. It's just politics as usual. So what do you say to those people who say it's just a game in Washington and there's nothing more at stake than that?
Well, there are 2 parts of that. So one is not a game. In that regards, it's very serious, and it is about life and death. And unfortunately, we've lost too many people, particularly from the environmental justice aspect. We lost too many people because of, I mentioned before, cancer, emphysema, and asthma. And they literally are saying, we can't breathe. And so it's not a game. in that regard. And so we need to fix that. It's not a game because the science is real. And we need to take that very seriously. It is what it is. So it's not a game for that aspect. But I do think this, though, Senator. We do need to have a real conversation. I am one who want to have a conversation with everyone. And I do want to say that we have had a climate movement that has been predominantly white and predominantly East Coast, West Coast, that has isolated a lot of the issues. And because of that, it doesn't look like everybody. Now, that's changing. I want to say that it's changing, but it's not changing fast enough. It's the reason why we need to have much more of storytelling and narrative organizing, and we need to ensure that we are creating those opportunities to broaden the movement. But that's where we are, though. So the reality is that the phosphate industry has manipulated that, and they have said they've created that and said, "Listen, this is just a bunch of, to be honest, white people wearing Birkenstocks, eating Ben and Jerry's. I like Ben and Jerry's, and I ain't nothing wrong with Birkenstocks. But I'm just saying, it's what they said is the case, and they said that those are the ones who actually care. And so, really, you and your community doesn't affect you, when it does affect you. And so we do need to take that narrative. We do need to broaden our movement. We do need to make sure and figure out how we can get more people to understand how it impacts them, because it's not a game and it's very real.
Yeah, when I was growing up, the Malden River was 4 blocks from my house. And by the way, I still live 4 blocks from the Malden River. And it's a blue-collar community, 65,000 people. And but along the river, when I was growing up, there was coal companies. Converse made every Converse All-Star right there on the Malden River, but they used the Malden River as a dumping ground. There were chemical companies, candy companies. They just were using the Malden River as a dumping ground. And my mother would say to me when I was 10, I was the oldest of the 3 boys. My mother would just say, "Eddie, whatever you do, don't swim in the Malden River." So that message from my mother was, "Eddie, you're not Tom Sawyer swimming on the Mississippi with Huckleberry Finn. Do not swim in the Malden River." And the reality is that all these companies historically have used the blue collar and poorer communities as their dumping grounds, and we have to basically now bring environmental justice to all of those communities. Malden High School, where I live, last year it was the graduating class from Malden High School was 27% white, 26% black, 25% Latino, 23% Asian, right? The most diverse high school in the United States. And ultimately, it's those kinds of communities, that are still bearing the disproportionate negative impacts from indiscriminate use of fossil fuels and chemical dumpings that impact the lives of the most vulnerable. So talk about Black History Month. Talk about what that message should be in 2022 so that people understand that the fight for climate justice and the fight for racial justice are inseparable.
Well, let me just say that I want to connect what you just said about the Malden River. I think that's very important. And I think your mother was a storyteller, and she was connecting dots for you, even in your youth. She understood where you were at that stage, and she understood to tell you as a little boy how important that is. That's important because those simple uh, abilities that we do, that a parent will do, that we'll do as a community leader, we need to tell those stories. We need to make sure people understand it as simple as your mother did, and that there's danger there, and that we need to get to all the policy to change that, so that those companies that are creating that pollution, that is creating it to be unsafe. But we also need to tell people and on the forefront. And so that's an important piece to the story. I just want to make sure this connect how important your mother was in what you did, because you are still here now to advocate and fight for a whole nother generation. So, because she didn't tell you that, it wouldn't be no Eddie. And so I want to thank her for what she did and thank you for listening.
And can I say, and let me just say this, mothers can be heroes, but heroes need help. So in my neighborhood growing up, in many, many days, there was just a big black cloud over our neighborhood. And it was something that no mother, no father can control. it takes the government to tell these companies, just cut it out, stop it. You're endangering the health of children. You're endangering the health of pregnant women in our society. And if you don't have the government in, then they're just going to continue. So that's why we need to get into this fight in a big way this year and pass the legislation. And maybe, Reverend Yearwood, you could talk a little bit about letting folks know the good news of what the movement has done so far.
That's right. Well, let me finish the other question too about about Black history. I'm going to make sure to connect that dot. I don't want to leap over racial justice now. I don't want to I don't want to skip that one. I want to get to the good news. I want to make sure that folks listening understand that climate justice is racial justice, and racial justice is climate justice, and we must connect the dots there. And that too long these fossil fuel industries, whose business plan has been a death sentence, have looked at particularly Black and brown and indigenous and poor communities as sacrifice zones. And they have literally figured them to be the path of least resistance. And so they have taken advantage. And so there are many cases where they have gone into these communities. And we now need to stand up and stop that. And so part of Black History Month and part of what we need to do now is to ensure that the lives of Black people and brown people and indigenous people, they matter. We need to extend those lives, and that needs to be one of the things. I had a conversation with the mayor, and the mayor was very excited that after his term was up, and this was actually a great thing, that the life expectancy of those who were in his city was longer than when he first became mayor. That's the kind of mentality that we need to have. I need for people, if you want to have a happy Black History Month, let's ensure that Black people's lives are living longer in this country. Let's ensure that Black people aren't being killed by the side of the road or being killed by the pollution in their community. That is the epitome of Black History Month. It's not about just celebrating who came and who spoke and who gave a speech. It's about making sure that the Black people who live today have better and powerful lives. But to the good news, which you mentioned, there's good news now.
Before we go to the good news, I'm glad you brought us back to this, because we're in the midst of a systematic attempt to suppress the Black vote in America, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how those fossil fuel and Republican efforts to suppress the Black vote will affect our efforts to combat the impact of the climate crisis in its effect upon those who are most vulnerable, those who are poorest, those who live in those neighborhoods that obviously have the highest rates of asthma or other diseases that are directly related to the climate crisis.
Yeah, no, to be very clear, democracy and climate are linked together. And it's very important that people understand that. At Hip Hop Caucus, we have a campaign called Respect My Vote. People can go there and check it out. So it's an amazing campaign at respectmyvote.com. But right now, democracy is literally on life support. And anybody, I really do mean anybody. I don't care what your party affiliation may be. You should be concerned that our democracy is in the state where it's at. And that is very important because the reality is that if folks' voices are not being heard, then we cannot have the policies and shape the policies that we need to do that can save lives. And so it is very scary right now. We're in a very scary time. And so there are those who are putting roadblocks, particularly against people of color, to ensure that their voices aren't heard. They're literally bringing back Jim Crow type laws. They're bringing back, in essence, poll taxes and the things that were so very disgusting in our history. They're bringing those things back in many different forms. They're gerrymandering. They're doing things to literally isolate and cut off votes. They're putting up roadblocks to voting. They're doing many things right now, and this is why it's so important that we pass voter laws to stop voter suppression in this country. And so I think that there are many laws that are there. Obviously, there's laws that are sitting in the Senate that unfortunately have not proceeded forward. There's my dear friend who passed away, one of my idols, obviously John Lewis. The bill's in his name that should move forward. But with that being said, we're not going to have strong climate policy until we have strong laws that protect our votes. And that's connected. So I'm hopeful that a lot of the climate activists who are on this call and in this conversation understand. I think a lot of them are wondering, well, how does that link? Why? I mean, we need to deal with climate, and we don't want to have mission drift. And democracy is not one of our issue, or neither is immigration, and neither is childcare, or neither is the issue regarding the movement for Black lives. Those are the issues. They are. It is all climate. It is all environment. So we have to really break the silos down and understand how these things connect. So democracy is directly connected to the issue of the climate crisis. And so with that being said, one of the reasons why that's important is that right now is a movement. You mentioned the victories. And so, I kind of use you, Senator Markey, as my point. This is where I kind of, I go back to 2011, where the movement was going through to where we are now in 2022. And I want to actually say that to me was also because of what you're now doing, how you stuck with it on the policy side and putting forth the Green New Deal and fighting for Build Back Better, but also in the streets. You're in the streets and we're in the streets. In the streets, we have been fighting too. So back then, we were told that the Keystone XL pipeline was a done deal. My dear friend Van Jones called me and told me himself, Rev, this is done. Secretary Clinton at that time, she's going to sign it and it's going to be a done deal. And we came together, and I'm telling you, there's something about organized people. Now, I might get a little happy on this call, but because at that moment we came together and we organized and mobilized and energized, and literally we fought against the Keystone XL pipeline and started a whole pipeline type of movement. And in that process, literally the first thing that President Biden did was cancel the Keystone XL pipeline. But on top of that, we canceled the Atlantic Coast pipeline. Down in Memphis, Tennessee, we've canceled the Byhalia pipeline. We put on hold the Mountain Valley pipeline, and there are many other pipelines that we should stop line 3 and we should stop line 5, and we should definitely, there's many other pipelines we need to stop. But in that, the movement, when it comes together, I have seen that organized people beat organized money every single time. And so we should be excited about that. The divestment movement, literally we were told then that it's ridiculous. It's not going to work to have these universities or pension funds or insurers divest. That's what we were told that 10 years ago. Now, 10 years later, we have divested trillions of dollars from fossil fuels and have moved that forward in a way that we've changed even how the markets are looking at the fossil fuel industry. So the good news is that when we come together and we have a long vision of success, then we can make things happen. Now, I do understand that there's something called the IPCC report that does give us a little bit of a time frame. So we don't have forever to get all these things done. So honestly, that brings a lot of anxiety. But I do want to say there is good news that when we do come together as a movement and understand our power from an electoral strategy, from a building conscious and storytelling strategy, and definitely to my street heat out there putting the pressure on. And I just want to say this one thing about street heat to those listening, for the young people. I want to commend you so much for what you're doing, because people need to see other people doing this work. And when other young people saw other young people, it allowed them to know they were not crazy. They understood this is a crisis, and they wanted to be a part of it. So I commend all the young people who are not giving up and staying the course to ensure that we get through this climate crisis.
Yeah. So what you're saying is right on the money. We have to stop Pipeline 3. We just can't allow it to come down into the United States. It's coming down through, their plan is to bring it down through Minnesota. And we didn't agonize, we organized around the Keystone Pipeline. And even though people felt that we could not win because of that movement, the political pressure was such that we did win. So we have to just believe in the organizational power of the people versus the moneyed interests. And you said it, the Republicans are trying to focus on crime in the streets. But the problem is the real crime is in the suites.
That's right.
It's the executives at the oil and gas companies that perpetrate these lies about climate change, about the health impacts, about the climate justice impacts, about the national security impacts, and that crime in the streets is much more well funded. But there's so many more out there now working and successfully to make this case, and that we have to change, and we have to change course. So there are trillions of dollars being matched, and the politics is actually moving in our direction. And maybe you could talk a little bit about why voters are going to be voting on climate justice in the upcoming midterms, so that everyone can understand what their role should be to take on those powerful moneyed crime in the sweeps cabal that has affected our politics for a century.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, since I'm talking to you, let me just say that, on that note, and I know you're working on this, we need to cut those subsidies too of those fossil fuel companies. Since we're talking about the money in the sweets, we need to cut out giving them money from the taxpayers. So that's a little side note. Just want I'm sure I know you're working on that though, but I just wanted to add that into the conversation, because I don't want to fund them myself with my tax money. But with that being the case, we have about 270 days before Election Day this year. And so there's definitely, people shouldn't be disgusted. I know a lot of the media like to say the cake is cooked and that there's going to be a change in the House, a change in the Senate. Ain't nothing cooked, because so it's very important for us to understand that your voice matters. And this is directly, this midterm and the next election after that are going to be two of the most important elections in regards to climate policy that we have. And also on the federal, not on the federal, but on the state and on the local level. We are seeing that across the country. I want to just commend so many great state policies for putting in climate car standards and other things in place. And that in part like Maryland and New Jersey and in California, I just want to commend them. So the electoral process is critical in regards to, and definitely Governor Inslee up there in Washington, with something that he's been putting together, carried over to the federal, but definitely on the state level. So I just want to make sure people understand that the electoral process is critical. And one of the last things I just want to make sure sitting there and say is that, one of the things we've been working on is definitely in regards to petrochemicals. The fossil fuel industry is they realize that we're not going to continue, that we are transitioning from fossil fuels to clean energy. But they're looking to now move to single-use plastics and fertilizer. And so one of the things I may come back to you with and others, that we have to stop petrochemicals, because that is actually in my home state of Louisiana, obviously, in many parts of this country, that they're looking to, the fossil industry has been looking for climate denial, climate delay, and climate dilution, and looking for an end-around plan. And so we got to stop petrochemicals as well, because they're looking to use plastics as a way to do that. So voting is critical, and this is going to be a critical election. And I believe in the people, and I believe we're going to win.
No, and I know we're going to win.
Come on now.
We're on the right side of history, but the hope comes from actions, comes from people actually going out and doing the work. Then we create the hope that builds this wave that will break down the power of these industries that have historically controlled the energy agenda for our country and for the planet. And Robert, when on Fox News and the fossil fuel industry, they say, well, what you want to do is socialism. And what I say is, well, if you give to the wind and solar and all electric vehicle and battery storage companies the same tax breaks you've given to the oil, gas, and coal industries for 100 years, you can call it socialism if you want. But I will tell you another thing. Within 10 years, there will be a revolution in this country, on this planet, that will have occurred, because you will now have empowered this generation to deploy those new technologies. So call it what you want, but it's like the pot calling the kettle black, right? When they're talking about socialism, because they have lived off of federal tax subsidies for 100 years.
Senator Mark, I want to tell you this. I know that we get ready to wrap up, but I want to tell you this. I know we got a whole lot of folks listening, but if you and I were having a private conversation, and it was just me and you, just so folks know, I'm playing the role of that old fashioned down south reverend, and you are that New England senator, and we had crossed paths. We had a conversation. I would tell you this. I would say, Senator Markey, what you're doing in regards to this legislation is critical. Never give up, never give in. And I know it's tough, but literally, I'm telling you, I've buried black babies in cities. I've had to fight mothers getting into caskets because their children died because of asthma in their living room. It means you never to give up hope. I need to keep fighting. The fossil fuel industry is probably the worst and most powerful force we've seen, but you have got to fight because right now you don't fight. If you and your colleagues give up or give in, then I'm gonna tell you something. Babies from my community will die. Not may die, not possibly die, but babies in my community will die. And I need you to keep on fighting. And know that your legacy of fighting for a world with clean water will be cherished. I mean cherished by future generations. So that's what I would tell you. I know we had an audience for that private conversation, but I want the world to hear how powerful what you've been doing and never give up, never give in, and keep fighting for the people because it's critical at this time in history.
Thank you so much, Reverend Yearwood, and thank you for being such a great inspiration. And for all of our listeners there, uh, can can you just tell people where they can find your work, Reverend Yearwood? Where can they go to find the Hip Hop Caucus work? What would be your message to them right after they hear this? Where should they go to hear more about your message?
Yeah, well, one, we got a podcast, it's an amazing award-winning podcast called The Coolest Show. It is based around environmental justice and climate justice and racial justice. So you can go to The Coolest Show, go to coolestshow.com. But everything you want to find about Hip Hop Caucus is simply at hiphopcaucus.org. Our programs regarding voting, you want to be a part of that. Programs regarding climate, be part of that. All of our programs, that you can go there and you can join us in this movement because we know that if we come together, the future is ours. So please go to hiphopcaucus.org and all about Twitter and obviously here. Join us, sir, but come join us because this is, as I said before, this is our lunch counter moment for the 21st century.
Uh, Thank you, Reverend Yearwood. Thank you for being such a historic leader on all of these climate justice issues. And thanks to all the listeners. Again, if you want to learn more about the Hip Hop Caucus work, about Reverend Yearwood, just click on his sites right now and just continue to learn because this is the movement. This is the soul of our powerful movement, and Reverend Yearwood is right at the heart. Is right there leading us. So thank you so much, Reverend Yearwood, and thanks to all the listeners for joining us today.